Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and to celebrate the new year and season 4 just around the corner, we're taking a look at Vikings. This is my absolute favourite historical TV show on right now. There's not a single bad episode that drags or feels like it doesn't have anything interesting to say. The characters feel real and authentic to the time period, and we get to see much of the Viking world in all its glory. From their political structure, their religion and its human sacrifices, to their methods of shipbuilding, and of course how they raided. But as great of a show Vikings is, it's not perfect, and there are loads of inaccuracies I'll talk about in this review. Since I'll be covering real Viking history, I have to warn you, there will be potential spoilers from seasons 1 to 3, and quite possibly beyond. Even though it hasn't happened in the show yet, I will discuss the fate of the real Ragnar Lothbrok and the exploits of his sons. Now, the show could possibly go off in a different direction, but I have a very strong feeling that these historical events will be adapted into the show. So, without further ado, this is Vikings. The Vikings came from the frozen lands of Scandinavia that make up the countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. With its bitterly cold winters, much of the landscape is covered with snow and ice during the winter months, and most of the region is marked by deep water fjords and mountains. For an agriculturally based society like the Vikings, land suitable for farming and maintaining livestock was a precious commodity aggressively contested by neighbouring clans. Civil war would often break out over fertile land, with farms and villages constantly being raided and pillaged. Some historians theorise that these conflicts were the result of a population explosion in the Viking numbers, and may have helped shape their society to become so warrior-based. So, with very few prospects to lead a good life, the Vikings looked to the high seas to seek their fortune. As often is the case with human beings struggling to survive, desperation is a great motivator for innovation. It is here that the Vikings made their greatest technological achievement, the longship. Unlike traditional ships of the age that needed to hug the coastline in order to get where they were going, the Viking longship had no such restrictions. Their revolutionary design allowed the Vikings to adapt to their environment. They could venture out into the open ocean, and they could sail up rivers. They were also light enough to be carried over land, and their low draft hull gave them another essential advantage, which was speed, and they were fast. With favourable conditions, a full sail, and all the men rowing, longships were able to reach speeds of up to 14 knots. This was extremely crucial to their success, as no other vessel of the age was able to catch up to them. The Vikings were also experts in navigation and used some pretty creative methods on their long voyages. One such example is that when they wanted to see if they were near land, they would release ravens they had brought aboard. If the ravens did not return, then that meant land was nearby, and they would sail in the direction the raven flew to. If it returned, then it meant there was no land in sight, at least for another 90 miles. There's also a theory that's been adopted by the show where the Vikings used sunstones, which were common calcite crystals, to locate the sun's position in an overcast sky. This theory does make sense to me, since the Vikings would use the sun more often to navigate, since they come from the high latitudes of Scandinavia, where summer days are very long, and also the summer provided better sailing conditions for their raids. Trying to find out how historically accurate Vikings is has been extremely difficult, because much of what we know about the real Vikings in the late 8th and early 9th century is shrouded in mystery, and that's because they didn't leave any written records. They were an illiterate people, and writing on parchment wouldn't be introduced in Scandinavia until the middle of the 11th century. Much of what we know comes from 3 different sources. One are the chronicles written by the Christians they came into contact with, who, understandably, had a very biased opinion about the Vikings. In fact, they made great efforts to demonize the Vikings in a very colourful and apocalyptic way. For example, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it is written on the attack on Lindisfarne, "Here were dreadful forewarnings come over the land of Northumbria, and woefully terrified the people. There were amazing sheets of lightning and whirlwinds, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. A great famine soon followed these signs, and shortly after, in the same year, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the woeful inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne." The second source of what we know with Viking history is the archaeological evidence they left behind in their burial mounds, their longships, and other places. And finally, there are the Viking sagas. Now, the sagas were the stories of the exploits of famous and great Vikings, often told around the fireside or in their great halls. These stories would rely on the memory of whomever was telling it, as they were being told time and time again. So you can imagine how much of that original story had been changed and elaborated over the years. I mean, it's basically like a messed up version of Chinese whispers, where the first message ends up being totally different from what was originally said.
Switch on the engine, pass it on.
Switch on the engine, pass it on.
Your voice.
Switch on the engine, pass it on.
Switch on the engine. Switch on the engine, pass it on. Switch on the engine, pass it on. Bitch on a pension, suck my dong.
What?
Now imagine 15 generations of these stories being told, and you can understand why it wouldn't be a good idea to take them at face value. By the time these sagas were finally written down, the Viking Age had been over for centuries, and they're so full of fantastical elements that they read like fairy tales. Ragnar's in particular, where it was said in his saga that he slayed a dragon to win over his first wife's hand in marriage. Then he pretty much says the same thing to win over Lagertha.
I went to confess my love to her, but I was set upon by a bear and an enormous hound who guarded her home. I killed the bear with my spear, and I managed to strangle the hound with my bare hands. And that is how I gained her hand in marriage.
So this almost gives the makers of the show a license to pretty much be as creative as they want with their depiction of Ragnar and Viking history. But there are some major inaccuracies embedded in the show that we know for certain didn't happen and also couldn't happen. Like for starters, Vikings presents Ragnar as the leader of the Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793. But he's also shown to be leading the attack on Paris, but that took place in 845. That's a gap of 52 years, there's no way he could have done both. I mean, like, let's do some basic math. How old is Bjorn before Ragnar sails off to Lindisfarne?
He's 12 years old.
Alright, so I'm gonna be generous here. Let's say Ragnar had Bjorn when he was 15 years old. That would make Ragnar 27 when he sailed off to Lindisfarne in 793. So, by the time he attacks Paris in 845, he would have been the ripe old age of 79. That's not even mentioning the time of his death, which was around 865, which would have made him 99 years old. So, sorry guys, but Ragnar Lothbrok wasn't at Lindisfarne, but he definitely was at Paris. So, why did Michael Hirst, the creator of Vikings, have to have Ragnar at Lindisfarne if he couldn't have been there?
I had a character who was very curious.
That's why we should sail west.
He needed to prove to me and then to the audience that he was someone worth following. So he had to want to go somewhere. And by the same token, someone was going to want to stop him. So that was drama.
That may be drama, but it's totally unfounded in history. The idea that in the late 8th century, Vikings did not know about England or any other lands to the west is just ridiculous.
There are no lands to the west.
Yes there are, and you've totally known about them for centuries. Not only that, but you had well-established trade networks with the Saxons and Frisians. And yet in the show, Ragnar Lothbrok is the one who discovered England. However, does this inaccuracy bother me? Not really. It is effective drama, but that's not the reason why. It's because this small plot point is foreshadowing what is to come later with Viking exploration. These are the guys who discovered Iceland, Greenland, and even North America 500 years before the Spanish ever did. And I'm fairly confident that this show will never cover famous explorers such as Leif Erikson. So this is about as close as we're ever going to get. And finally, there are the costumes worn by the Vikings. You're probably going to think I'm very petty here, but I'll ask you this. If you've ever popped into a museum and checked out the Viking exhibition, did you ever want to see a display case featuring the infamous leather biker gear that all the characters in the show seem to be wearing? I admit that their black leather tunics may look cool, but they're totally impractical and don't offer any protection. I mean, unless they were half-naked berserkers tripping out on magic mushrooms, then Vikings would wear gambeson, which was a padded jacket, and if they could afford it, then they would wear chainmail over it along with a metal helmet. A real Viking would look something like this. I'm just thinking that now that we've moved on from the stereotype of Vikings wearing horned helmets, there's no real reason to just not go all the way in my opinion. I could literally spend 20 minutes just nitpicking this show on its numerous inaccuracies, but I'm not going to do that because to sum everything up, it all boils down to two questions. Is Vikings historically accurate? Not exactly. Is Vikings historically authentic? Yes, absolutely. To me, Vikings is an example of the perfect balance between creative licensing for dramatic effect and yet remaining truthful to the time period. They may not look like Vikings, but they certainly act like Vikings, they speak like Vikings, and their morals are that of Vikings. If you want to know what really sold me with the show, it was in the episode where Ragnar and his men raid Lindisfarne. I remembered reading about this raid long before the show was ever made, and I was curious to see how far they were going to take it. How faithful were they going to be?
Nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Pater Noster qui es in caelis. Pater
This is exactly what happened in real life. The Vikings came in, butchered and enslaved these poor defenseless men. And yet these are our main protagonists in the show. Whether we see them slaughtering priests or raping nuns, we as an audience shouldn't be able to sympathize with these characters. At least according to the absurd logic applied by so many god-awful historical movies. But the makers of Vikings don't pussyfoot around the subject, and that's what I love about this show, because it's unapologetic and doesn't flinch at the idea of being authentic. I think Leonardo DiCaprio said it best in his interview for Wolf of Wall Street, when he was asked about how audiences would react to the characters in his movie.
Well, that's always the big question that you have going into a movie, whether, you feel audiences will be responsive to people committing atrocious acts. And it all depends on, not only the subject matter, but I think the honesty in the way you depict these people. And that was one of the things that Marty said very early on. He's like, through my experiences in making movies, if you're authentic with the characters and who they are and don't betray that, people will go along with anything.
It sounds like it should be a no-brainer, but we see so many movies that feel like it has to hold the audience's hand like a child. I mean, you only need to look at some of the crappy films I've reviewed so far. For example, in The Patriot, Benjamin Martin frees his slaves and treats them as equals in a time where that was not a normal thing to do. In 1492, Christopher Columbus is a tree-hugging hippie who wants to protect Native Americans even though the real Columbus committed genocide. In Kingdom of Heaven, Balian of Evil is presented as a social justice warrior, even though the real Balian was totally committed to his crusade against the Saracens. I swear to God, that if Roland Emmerich or Ridley Scott were to direct this show, then they would have some bullshit scene where Ragnar stands up to his comrades and says, "No, Rollo, we shouldn't do this. Killing unarmed priests is wrong." But fortunately, he doesn't do that. Not once do we see Ragnar try to step in and stop his men killing innocents. In fact, the only time we see him show any compassion is when he notices a little girl hiding in a corner. First, he checks to see if his men aren't looking, then he covers the girl with a blanket. Now, I'm sure if his men had noticed, then Ragnar wouldn't have done anything to stop them from killing her. Very dark stuff, I know, but you have to understand that the Vikings were not known for showing compassion. There was one famous Viking called the Child Lover because he refused to kill babies, which the other Vikings thought was hilarious because they did that kind of stuff all the time. Terror tactics such as these were exactly why so many Christians fled in sight of the Vikings.
They are coming. Let us prepare. Look at what they've done. Look at the lead boat.
Now, is this scene historically accurate? Not exactly, but it's very close to something Ragnar really did in Francia but not in Mercia. In 845, Ragnar launched a fleet of 120 longships to attack Paris, sailing up the Seine. Charles the Bald, the Frankish emperor, split his army into two halves and assembled them on both sides of the river. Ragnar decided to attack the much smaller force whilst the other half was unable to do anything except watch their comrades be slaughtered on the other side of the bank. Then Ragnar rounded up 111 prisoners, sailed them to a small island in the middle of the river, and had them all hanged in full sight of the remaining Frankish forces, who all fled in terror. Unopposed, the Vikings were able to directly attack the city, and after much heavy fighting, they finally got in and sacked Paris. They only stopped short of burning it to the ground when Charles the Bald, the Frankish emperor, paid them a ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold to leave. He hoped that this payment would be enough to stop future Viking incursions. It didn't. It in fact had the exact opposite effect and would encourage more Vikings to leave Scandinavia in search of plunder. The sack of Paris was to be Ragnar's legacy and greatest achievement, but it would be nothing compared to what his sons would accomplish.
The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok will be spoken of as long as men have tongues to speak.
They will enjoy that much fame.
One of them will marry the daughter of a king. Another will discover and sail around a sea that has no tides. All this and more have I foreseen.
Then they will have more fame than I, their father.
One of the reasons why I believe Ragnar Lothbrok really existed is because we know his sons existed. I find it hard to believe that if they all lied about him being their father, then why did no one ever call them out on it? A single generation is not that big of a gap in time in order to lie about something that big. In any case, whilst Ragnar's existence is called into question by academics, the bloody legacy left behind by his sons is not, eclipsing their father's greatest achievements by a milestone. Now, Ragnar had many sons, but in the interest of time, I'm going to talk about my favourite two. In the show, the seer prophesies how one son would discover and sail around the sea that has no tides, and that son was Bjorn Ironside. He would go on to lead the longest Viking raid of all. In 859, Bjorn and his brother Hastin left the Seine River with a host of 62 longships and sailed to the Mediterranean, the sea with no tides. As they raided along the Spanish coastline, they came into direct contact with the Moors. The following battles intensified as the Vikings sacked the cities of Lisbon, Seville, and Cadiz, and fought their way through the Straits of Gibraltar. Then they landed in Morocco, plundered the city of Necker, and enslaved its population. Continuing on with further raids along North Africa, Bjorn's fleet sailed to the south of France, where they spent the winter before pillaging Narbonne, Nîmes, and Arles. Then Bjorn set out on the most ambitious raid of all, the city of Rome. However, upon arriving in the north of Italy, the Vikings mistook the city of Luna for Rome instead. Since it was too well fortified for a direct attack, they asked for a truce, stating that Hastin was sick and wanted to die a Christian. The clergy came out, then baptized him, and the very next day, word had reached the city's bishop that Hastin had died and his last wish was to be buried in consecrated ground within the city walls. I think you can see where I'm going with this. It was actually Hastin, not Ragnar Lothbrok, who burst out of the coffin and hacked his way to the city gates, allowing the Vikings to storm in and sack the city. The brothers then raided Sicily and more of the North African coast before finally turning to head home. However, the Straits of Gibraltar, they were intercepted by a Moorish fleet and lost 40 ships when the Moors used Greek fire on them. Even so, the wealth Bjorn accumulated in his raid of the Mediterranean set him up for life as one of the wealthiest and most successful Vikings in history. And his success may have had a helping hand in his father's demise, as Ragnar's jealousy made him become more reckless and arrogant with his raids. In 865, during a terrible thunderstorm, Ragnar was shipwrecked in Northumbria and was captured by King Aila. Finally having the chance for his long-awaited vengeance, King Aila had Ragnar thrown into a pit of poisonous snakes. According to legend, Ragnar's last words before dying was, "How the young piglets would squeal if they knew what the old boar suffers." With Ragnar's death, King Aila had sealed the fate of England, as Ragnar's sons would invade Northumbria in 866 with the largest Viking invasion in history. They would make up the commanders of what was to be known as the Great Heathen Army, and leading them was Ivar the Boneless. Now, for some of you who just watched the show and may not know a lot about Viking history, you may be surprised to find out that little deformed baby that Ragnar thought couldn't possibly survive in their world became the most feared and ruthless Viking of his age. And this was all in spite of his potential disability. According to Ragnar's sagas, Ivar was born from a curse prophesied by his mother Aslaug on their wedding night.
No, we cannot have sex. Not for 3 days.
No more prophecies. Just want to feel the warmth of it.
I am afraid. Afraid of what? When Ragnar came to the farmhouse, he wanted to have sex. I told him if he forced himself on me, in the first 3 days of his return, I would bear him a monster.
As to why Ivar was called the Boneless is the subject of much debate. The sagas say that he was born without any bones in his legs, which is of course a medical impossibility. One theory suggests that Ivar suffered from brittle bones disease, which makes the most sense to me, seeing how the sagas mentioned that he had to be carried around on a shield since he was unable to walk. Another theory was that the name Boneless was actually an ironic nickname, kind of like Little John from Robin Hood, and that Ivar was in fact a really big guy with larger than average bones. The last theory is actually the funniest to me, since the name Boneless could have implied that Ivar was either impotent or just not interested in sex. The sagas do say that neither love nor lust played any part in Ivar's life. If that's true, then his name might as well be Ivar the Boneless. There's a few more theories out there, but at the end of the day, it really is irrelevant. He's remembered not for his name, but for what he did. When the great heathen army of several thousand Vikings landed in Northumbria, its purpose was not to raid, but to conquer. They managed to take the city of York, the Northumbrian capital, and after a few battles, the sons of Ragnar finally got their revenge as they captured King Aila. Ivar ordered that he be given the most gruesome of all Viking executions, the Blood Eagle.
What is a blood eagle? The offender gets down on his knees, and his back is open with knives. And then, with axes, his ribs are chopped away from his spine. And then his lungs are pulled out of this huge bleeding wound and laid upon his shoulders, so they look like the folded wings of a great eagle. And he must stay like that until he dies.
For the next 20 years, the Great Heathen Army would destroy many of the old kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Only the Kingdom of Wessex was able to stand up to the Viking onslaught, led by one of the greatest kings in English history, Alfred the Great.
All that remains of England is Wessex. The birth of an England, the idea of a single kingdom called England, has to begin here. There is nowhere else.
But for how long will Wessex remain?
The fate of Wessex will be determined by Englishmen, all Englishmen. Only by joining together and saving Wessex can we have England. Only by saving Wessex can we have a Northumbria, a Bebbanburg.
And if Wessex can't be saved?
Then we are all no more.
Overall, I'd say that this show does an excellent job of creating effective drama without compromising too much of Viking history. And I'm really excited to see how Season 4 will turn out, especially what will happen to Rollo, which I will discuss very briefly. Now, this won't be like some other videos on YouTube that are pretending to predict Season 4 based on nothing but conjecture and personal interpretation. It's like they seem to totally forget that this is a historical drama, not the newest fantasy show like Game of Thrones. Many elements are fictitious, of course, but the key events behind the real historical figures must take place. With Ragnar, he has to attack Paris and he has to die in the Pit of Snakes. The same can be said with Rollo. Now, his character is based on a real Viking chieftain called Rollo, also known as Rolf the Walker. Colourfully named so because he was apparently so big that no horse could support his weight. Which pretty much sums up our Rollo in a nutshell. Anyway, the real Rollo was not Ragnar Lothbrok's brother. He actually had no relation to him whatsoever. He did, however, lead a totally different attack on Paris in 885 and invaded Francia again in 911. The Frankish emperor offered his daughter Princess Gisla's hand in marriage, which we see in the show, and also signed a treaty in which he would cede Frankish lands at the mouth of the Seine to Rollo. These would be known as the Land of the Northmen, later called Normandy. Rollo then converted into Christianity under the name of Robert, the first Duke of Normandy. The condition of this treaty was that he would protect the Franks against any more Viking invasions. So, in Season 4, we will finally see Rollo step out of Ragnar's shadow with a kingdom of his own, destined to be one of the most powerful in Europe.
I love him. He is my brother. He's taken me back. But I am so angry. Why? Am I still so angry? You tell me, wise one. Or I will tell you. It is because I am useless, feckless, hollowed out by failed ambitions, by failed loves. Nothing good can ever come of my life now. What is there to laugh about?
Oh, Rollo, if you truly knew what the gods have in store for you, you would go down now and dance naked on the beach.
I don't understand.
I tell you as I told Ragnar, the bear will marry a princess, and I can tell you that you will be present at the ceremony.
Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know in the comment section what you thought about Vikings, and of course, what historical movie should I review next. In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.